I'm grateful for the invitation. I'm also grateful for the mercifully short introduction. Small and somewhat awkward preface. So I gave a talk on this very topic here about 5 years ago, and just in the extremely unlikely event that anybody was there half a decade ago, I just want to say that you might recognize some of the analytical framework, but I promise you that there will be an analysis of, well, more recent developments later on. So it's not a matter of being a one-pony trick, or maybe it is, but the pony occasionally can extend the trick a little bit towards the present. All right, with that awkward thing out of the way, when people in Europe and in parts of Latin America hear the words Christian democracy, in all likelihood, they are thinking of political parties, some of which, as everybody knows, have lost the dominant role they once had in parts of Western Europe, Italy in particular. In the United States, if you say the two words Christian democracy, people might start to freak out, thinking that this is some vision of, Christian nationalism, some violation of the First Amendment in terms of the Establishment Clause or something along those lines. And I dare say that in the rest of the world, people might simply be puzzled when they hear these two words. Now, my talk will eventually get around to saying something about political parties. But for the sake of our discussion this evening, I take Christian democracy actually to be a kind of challenge, if you like, problem or question. Namely the question that people started to pose in my analysis ever since the end of the 18th century about a possible reconciliation between modern democracy and religion, and what I will specifically focus on will be Catholicism. In other words, I'm interested in political thinkers and actors who accepted Tocqueville's view that in the modern world, democracy was more or less inevitable. For sure, a view that maybe fewer and fewer of us have today. That also means that, of course, there are plenty of people who didn't make this assumption, who were fighting against modern democracy in all kinds of ways. I will leave those aside and simply look at thinkers and actors who, in one form or another, try to make, so to speak, democracy safe for religion and for Catholicism in particular. Now, it might be worth to spell out a little bit more in detail what exactly they perceive to be the obstacles to be overcome, the problems to be solved, so to speak. I think there are at least two. One is what you might call a sort of moral psychological challenge. An understanding of democracy as a matter of, in a very ambitious way, perhaps both individual and collective self-determination. A kind of promise that, at least according to some of his interpreters, someone like Rousseau essentially holds out. Now, one can perhaps see why for some religious actors, this understanding of human self-empowerment, this understanding that we can master our own fate, be it at an individual level, be it at a collective level, can seem like a form of human pride, of sinfulness, of a certain kind of human vanity. I leave that challenge aside for the moment, happy to talk more about it later on if you wish. I want to specifically focus on a second challenge. And the second challenge can perhaps be best captured by what many of you will recognize as a famous contemporary definition of democracy. I'm thinking of Adam Przeworski's understanding of democracy as institutionalized uncertainty. Probably not necessary to spell out in great detail, but just in case, what he was after was that in halfway working democracies, political outcomes should be largely uncertain, while at the same time, the procedures, the processes by which we arrive at these outcomes should have a reasonable certainty. Whereas in autocracies, it's of course exactly the other way around. You always know who will win presidential elections in Russia. At the same time, the procedures, the processes can be fiddled with literally up until the last minute before the election. Just think back maybe to 2018, when in the face of the challenge and the new strategies by Navalny, they were changing the system literally up until the last minute. Now, if you take this idea of institutionalized uncertainty seriously, one can perhaps see why uncertainty is bound to generate anxieties for certain actors under certain circumstances. What, for instance, if you happen to be a religious actor who is very afraid of an aggressive secular majority coming to power and then using power in some form or another against religious actors? So the challenge for people who more or less framed things this way would have been to say, okay, we do want to stick with democracy, which means there always is going to be uncertainty. At the same time, there might be ways of lessening that uncertainty without going for the option, which, as everybody here knows, also proved very attractive for many people, at least throughout the 20th century. Just think of specifically Catholics who basically said, we are most comfortable in a state like Salazar's Portugal or Franco's Spain. No uncertainty, obviously, under those circumstances. But if you take on the challenge of uncertainty, what ways might there be of, again, trying to make democracy somewhat safer for religious actors? I want to outline three particular strategies, which first developed in the 19th century, then were applied again in somewhat different ways in the 20th century, and which today I think have been complemented by new approaches which initially can look like they are a continuation of these traditions, but I will try to convince you that in certain ways they actually mark a rupture, or to put it even more bluntly, in a certain way, even a kind of betrayal of these earlier traditions. Now, before getting to these three strategies, let me perhaps sort of anticipate two objections to this very framework of analysis, which occasionally tend to come up. One set of objections particularly would emanate from political scientists. Political scientists who would say, look, you don't need to look at this in great detail. There's an answer to this kind of challenge. And the answer could, for shorthand, be summed up in the slogan, moderation through inclusion. Once you truly bring religious actors into the democratic game, sooner or later, they will fully adapt to democracy, and maybe democracy will fully adapt to them. Or, as the perhaps somewhat paradoxical sounding formulation by our colleague Statis Kalivas, really two very different people, once had it can basically be the politicization of religion, which paradoxically can lead to the secularization of politics. Again, I feel I'm belaboring a point which everybody knows very well, but again, just in case, the idea is, of course, that once you include actors who might have very strong convictions, have very strong doctrines, maybe have very strong theologies in a government, these people cannot just pontificate about doctrines and theologies and ideologies day and night. They, of course, in order to get re-elected, will sooner or later have to solve real problems, which is also why frivolously some people call this the pothole theory of moderation. You actually need to fill potholes, basically get something done that makes you popular among an electorate. You cannot just do extremist stuff all the time. As again, many people in this room know, this was a very popular theory for many years. I dare say, but I'm happy to be corrected on this perception if you think it's wrong, that this sort of took a massive hit during and after the Arab Spring. During those times, many people were very confident along the lines of, yes, include the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, in government, and eventually you are going to see moderation. And evidently, things didn't quite turn out this way. Why they didn't, again, we can debate. Maybe a simple rejection of the moderation through inclusion thesis is as simplistic as some of the proponents made the initial promise out to be as well. Anyway, so this is one set of challenges, if you like, that basically said we don't have to kind of bother in great detail with particular strategies. Let's just basically draw on this idea. A second set of objections would be very, very different. It would basically come from political theorists and I dare say from some religious actors themselves, who would say, look, the solution is already inside, many would say, Christianity. Think of a philosopher like Marcel Gauchet, who famously said that Christianity is the religion of the exit from religion. Or, perhaps more familiar to many of you, think of Charles Taylor, who in some of his early writings said that for the real sort of essence of Christianity to come out, it took a breach with Christian culture. It had to kind of liberate itself from certain elements, but it was always going to be the religion of democracy and human rights. I'm obviously putting it in a very crude and simplistic way, but that is basically the position. And note how, again, in a certain way, what follows from this is that we wouldn't have to bother in great detail with particular political strategies of making democracy safe for religion, because in a sense it was always already there as a promise. Now, as you can tell by now, I reject both of these sets of objections. It's perhaps worth noting that even though they are so different, because one of them is very, very general, whereas the other one is completely religion-specific, even though they're so different, they do have one thing in common. Read uncharitably, one could say that both of them are, in a sense, forms of determinism. You do always already know in advance what's going to happen. And of course, my starting point is that it's sort of inherent to democracy that you don't really have this kind of certainty. Who knows ultimately which way it's going to go? And that's precisely the reason why both religious and political actors were so eager to work out more concrete political strategies. And not just political strategies as in electoral strategies, but more particularly also bodies of thought, which in a sense had to do two things at the same time. That kind of political thought, on the one hand, had to reassure non-religious actors that religious actors were truly committed to democracy. At the same time, it had to reassure religious actors that when they committed to democracy, they weren't simply selling out. They weren't simply betraying some of their beliefs and now coming around to some form of liberalism, which, as you all know, for a long time had been seen as the enemy of religious actors. So it took a particular kind of approach to make this plausible. Now on to the three strategies, which I think formed the core of what some of these actors were trying to do. The first one basically comes down to saying, look, democracy is going to be less risky if the people themselves, the demos, if you like, is as Christian, or from the point of view of the people I'm mostly talking about, as Catholic as possible. Then it's simply, in a very obvious way, less likely that things are going to go wrong. This, in essence, I think was the approach of figures who are often called Catholic liberals in France. Figures like Lamennais, probably most famously, they weren't very liberal, I think it's fair to say, but they certainly hit upon exactly this idea. Lamennais famously said, let us not reject the French Revolution, let us baptize the French Revolution. And let us basically hope that the people can be as religious, as faithful as possible, and then they can also, in a sense, be trusted to engage in elections, to govern themselves, etc. It's very obvious as a basic thought, but this is basically what some of the early proponents of this strategy hit upon in the early 19th century. The person who, in a sense, may have spelled this out in the most interesting way, maybe not a surprise for many of you, you might say, is none other than Tocqueville. Remember that contrary to what is often casually said, Tocqueville did not claim that there was a profound affinity between democracy and Protestantism. He actually said the best citizens, the most faithful and the most independent, happen to be Catholics. As everybody knows, he wasn't really talking to Americans when he said this, because they would have said, wait a minute. He was talking to people back in France, who, of course, at the time were confronted with, a very strong opposition between, broadly speaking, democracy and religion. Now, what was he trying to say? As many of you will remember from Democracy in America, his basic idea was, look, liberty can be difficult to live with for human beings. So many choices, so much potential for disorientation. But if you have a fixed point, then liberty becomes much more livable. Now, what could that fixed point possibly be? Of course, religious certainty. And that's the reason, in essence, why he said, and that will also ensure that actually Catholics are going to be the best citizens, because they are going to have that sort of fixed point, and then they're very comfortable living a life of liberty, including a life of political liberty beyond that. So that's strategy number one in the 19th century. Strategy number two features a perhaps more surprising protagonist. It's a person who has a really, really, really bad reputation in the history of ideas, mostly thanks to Isaiah Berlin, somebody who's often been accused of having been a fascist or a proto-fascist. I'm talking about Joseph de Maistre. Now, there are many things you can find in Maistre's writings which would back up this view that he was a pretty authoritarian character. I'm not disputing that. But he was also a complicated thinker. And the bit that I want to pick out as a basic idea, or if you like basic strategy, revolves around his writings on the papacy, where he basically develops the idea that you shouldn't bet on the demos, the people themselves, in the way that Lamennais and others were trying to do, because, hey, the people are just sinful and generally hopeless. But maybe you can find institutions that can keep the people in check, because then you've solved the problem in a different way. And in his writings on the papacy, in essence, that's what he proposed. He basically said, what if the papacy were part of a sort of European system of checks and balances that will keep individual nations in check? I'm happy to say more about what exactly he envisaged with that. But again, the basic idea is very intuitive. It's a sort of version, if you like, of constitutionalism, of saying if there is a framework that will keep the people in check, then even if you distrust the people a great deal, you might eventually be on the safe side. So note how what most people would think of immediately only actually really enters the picture after these first two strategies have been formulated. As, again, everybody will know in this room, it's only really towards the end of the 19th century that Christian democratic parties are being formed. They are mostly formed in countries that experience what Catholics perceive as a kind of attack by secular liberal states on some of the things they care most about. So unlike what is sometimes said, it's not true that the more religious the country, the more likely you are to have a Christian democratic party. In fact, the logic is almost the other way around. If religion isn't really contested in any shape or form, you're actually very unlikely to have parties like this, because in a sense there's nothing to defend. There's no reason to form what, to put it crudely, can look like a sort of interest group way of justifying a party. What is perhaps also worth reminding ourselves of is that very early on, these parties were of course participating in representative parliamentary democracy, but participation did not signal endorsement. When they had words like folk or popolo in their names, that was certainly meant to suggest that they were close to the people, that they cared about the social question, but it did rarely signal anything like an actual endorsement of modern pluralism. And of course, again, on a very basic intuitive level, it's easy to see why religious actors might not immediately be able to endorse pluralism, as if all these are simply, one option among many others. The papacy, as is also well known, has a very conflicted relationship with these parties. Sometimes popes endorse them, at other times they basically forbid individual Catholic citizens to participate in national politics, most famously, almost infamously, in Italy itself, where it's only after the First World War that a pope says, okay, it's now okay to have really a Christian democratic party and to participate in electoral politics. Anyway, so there you have it. These are the three strategies in a nutshell. I will briefly try to make it plausible that we see versions thereof in the 20th century as well, but with some adaptations to, of course, very different historical circumstances. The protagonist for the let's bet on a Christian demos is, maybe not surprising for many of you, Jacques Maritain, the famous French philosopher, one of the architects of our modern human rights regime, who was certainly prepared to say that a fully Christian demos is unlikely to be realized in the circumstances of the 20th century. He explicitly said it's a misfortune that we no longer live in that kind of world, but we simply have to deal with it. He nevertheless clung to the idea that you can trust the people on one level by suggesting that as long as you have strongly committed minorities who are inspired by the gospel, then in a sense you can still be fairly sure that nothing will go too wrong with the people as a whole. He used the expression prophetic shock minorities to basically gesture at this notion that you needed strongly committed smaller groups who could sort of revive maybe a larger ethos in a democracy. He also very explicitly says, as long as there's some people there who can draw on this kind of inspiration, it'll be okay for a democracy as a whole. When he thought about prophetic shock minorities, he wasn't always just thinking about, let's say, priests or people involved in Catholic social action. Examples for these prophetic shock minorities that are maybe less intuitively obvious were for him Gandhi and Saul Alinsky, who of course became sort of totally demonized after Hillary Clinton wrote her senior thesis on him. So it was this kind of conduct which could act as what he called a ferment in a larger democratic context, could serve to renew a larger democratic ethos. Now, what about the second strategy? I think the best example of that in the 20th century is less a matter of individuals, it's more a group, and I'm thinking of the group that gave us basically the European Convention of Human Rights. As we've learned from especially the work of our colleague, the historian Marco Duranti, it was basically Western European Christian Democrats and, less well known, British Tories who worked this out as what many people still see as the most successful regional human rights regime in the world. And of course, it, among other things, had a very clear anti-Soviet, anti-socialist impulse, but it was also based on this notion that you cannot truly trust the people themselves. You should build in, if you like, a supranational layer of protections against individual countries possibly deviating from a democratic path. So this is, in a sense, a version of the second strategy. The third strategy is, of course, what you might call the truly Christian democratic moment in Western Europe after 1945, when in a number of countries, most famously Germany and Italy, but others, Benelux countries, France to some degree as well, these parties are not just dominant parties, but they basically construct institutional frameworks within which I would say, for the most part, still live. The shapes that welfare states took in this period, European integration, of course, family policies, all of that was the work of these kinds of actors. What is perhaps not so obvious is that even in countries where critics were highly skeptical of what was happening, Catholics themselves didn't necessarily trust this new democratic era. The country I'm thinking of as a prime example of this is actually West Germany. It's, I think, virtually forgotten how many observers, both inside and outside the country, for a long time had suspicions that this might turn out badly in one way or another. Some critics were worried that actually Christian Democrats hadn't truly committed to democracy. Thinking, for instance, of an American intellectual historian who some of you may remember, H. Stuart Hughes, who taught at Harvard for a long time. He would basically say, look, Christian democracy, the Christian is always going to be more important than the Democrat part. And he was, writing piece after piece, basically saying, I'm not very optimistic about these experiments in Germany and Italy. Once these parties really consolidate power, they might truly deviate from democracy. And that was actually not an isolated voice. In fact, what we nowadays very often hear about Islam, in principle maybe incompatible with democracy, was of course for many, many decades said about Catholicism. In the 1950s, you would have found plenty of people who would have said, look, of course it's not an accident that democracies are never consolidating in the Iberian Peninsula, not to speak of Latin America, because look, yet more proof that Catholicism, which, hey, is a kind of monarchy in its basic structure, and democracy are fundamentally incompatible. Many sort of people thought that as outside observers and critics, but even on the inside, many Catholics were not truly happy with this new settlement. And the reasons were very often very specific concerns about education and family policy. And I just want to highlight one important episode of how, in the face of this ongoing skepticism, particular political theorists, in this case actually a particular jurist, was able to formulate a theory which turned out to be quite successful in removing some of these remaining doubts. I'm thinking of the German jurist Ernst Wolfgang Burkenfur, who maybe some of you recognize as a very peculiar figure because he was a social democrat. He served on the German Constitutional Court, and yet he was also famously a pupil, as the phrase went, of Carl Schmitt. In the 1950s, he wrote an article where he basically said, come on, fellow Catholics, we got to accept these new democratic structures. Democracy, and that was exactly basically the kind of language that I was starting out with this evening, democracy is always a matter of uncertainty and risk. You're never going to be able to remove that risk entirely unless you abolish democracy as a whole. And what you should ideally think of developing is what he called a democratic ethos, where you see your fellow citizens as partners, as political partners in a shared project based on freedom and equality, and where you sort of give each other leeway to trust each other that you will not fundamentally deviate from freedom and equality, be it in a religious direction or be it in an aggressively secular direction that will end up oppressing religious minorities. So a little bit what some of you may actually recognize from Ronald Dworkin's partnership conception of democracy. Now, you can't imagine how much pushback this still got in the late 1950s. And Burkenfur responded to that pushback with an article which actually caused even more brouhaha or scandals, when in the early 1960s he wrote a short piece that was much more historical with the title The Situation of German Catholicism in 1933. He was basically the first who looked in detail on what had happened exactly when the Nazis came to power, how the church had positioned itself, how priests had talked, and so on. And he basically showed that the church had said, okay, as long as we get exactly what we want in the areas of education and other morally charged policy questions, we're happy with this kind of regime. Big scandal at the time because most people, of course, wanted to forget that history, did not want to be reminded about these sorts of compromises. But the reason that Burkenfur brought it up was, of course, to say, look, you got to buy into the whole package of democracy. And if you go for something else, which initially might seem attractive, because authoritarians, or even totalitarians in this case, give you initially what you want, you might initially be okay with that. But eventually, it's not going to work out. And this kind of compromise is going to come and haunt you big time. And eventually, people were kind of willing to come around to this view and say that, yeah, this was maybe normatively the right thing to say, but also in a sense he had some historical backup to say that the alternatives are going to turn out to be very, very unattractive. Anyway, allow me to fast forward to our own era. As everybody knows, the story of Christian democratic parties is not necessarily a happy one for those who belong to that tradition. Virtually disappeared, or maybe to put it more politely and more gently, sort of been dispersed in Italy into various sort of successor parties of one form or another, steady decline in a number of other countries. And yet at the same time, I would say two new developments which should give us pause and which also more particularly pose the question how these new developments relate back to the story that I've been trying to make plausible to you so far. The first new development, no prizes for guessing, is the rise of what you might simply call Christian populism, or what some of you may recognize with Rogers Brubaker's famous formulation as Christianism. Best probably summed up by the current Italian Prime Minister, who in her autobiography / manifesto, Io sono Giorgia, explicitly writes, you can be secular and you can still be Christian. I think this says it about as clearly as one can say it, that this is not really about believing, it's all about belonging. Populists, of course, tend to say that they and only they represent what they often call a real people. They owe their followers a description of their real people. They have to provide some content. They need to deliver some substance. And there's religion. There's a story about how Christianity is not about ethics, is not about what you actually do. It's not about even belief. It is simply about belonging to the right people. As everybody in this room knows, for most of these actors, the main point of making these sorts of claims is to develop a contrast between Christianity, Christian Europe, etc. And, well, everybody knows, what the other thing is. So it's part of a broader political strategy, which, alas, seems to have worked out pretty well for many of these actors. Secondly, less well known perhaps, and certainly not as pervasive as Christianism / Christian populism, is a new form of what, for shorthand, but I think not unjustly, you can call hard right Catholic political and legal theory. Some of you who've been part of the workshop that has taken place here over the last 2 days will recognize some of the names here, in particular the Harvard jurist Jan-Werner Müller, who put out what he called common good constitutionalism as a new theory, largely based on Aquinas, that was meant to basically replace existing liberal theories in jurisprudence and political theory more broadly. Some of his positions, I think, have not unjustly been called all-out integralist. So that's, of course, the most extreme thing you can do in response to democracy as institutionalized uncertainty. If you basically, overcome separation of church and state, you more or less are willing to move to something that eventually might actually look damn, close to what Franco and Salazar were doing in the 20th century. But to be fair, Müller is a complicated thinker. Not everything is reducible to just this dimension, and I can't possibly do justice to his thought in just a few minutes this afternoon. I simply want to basically pick out one dimension of his theories, which means I leave aside the broader theological discussion. I also leave aside the discussions in American jurisprudence. Part of the reason why his thinking has been very attractive for many people is that he's also supplied a whole range of reasons against originalism. So all of a sudden, within American conservative legal thought, you don't have to necessarily be an originalist. There's something else on offer now. I also leave aside his more particular positions on policy questions like marriage. All of that I'm happy to talk about more if you like later on. I simply want to say something about his claims as far as political institutions are concerned. And again, some of you actually heard this earlier today from Fabio Wolkenstein. He very clearly says common good constitutionalism is compatible with a range of institutional setups. We should have what he calls performance standards and not design standards. So if something that happens not to be democracy is better at delivering the common good, then there's really no sort of reason not to go for that alternative, because the common good, so to speak, should trump, no pun intended, all these other considerations. Now, what this leads to in practice in his thinking is, to some degree, also sounding a little bit like populism, because he draws, for instance, on a very elaborate account of what happened in ancient Rome when he says, look, you had all these corrupt elites, you had optimates who were not really pursuing the common good. It was a really great outcome when the people themselves would ally with a good emperor. If you're worried what to do next, always conjure up the good emperor, all problems will be solved. And the emperor, in conjunction with the people, could then proceed to realize the common good. And he draws a parallel between that and the good Chinese emperor, who always might come in handy if needed. And he even, in a footnote, which I can't help but read as somewhat frivolous, he says, you could also think of an example like what Max Weber said about the Reichspräsident in his writings in the late 19th teens, which makes you wonder, okay, do we remember what happened later on with that president during the Weimar Republic? Never mind. All I'm trying to get across here is that he's willing to basically justify an extraordinary concentration of power, and specifically executive power. And I belabor that point because this is one of the moments when one sees a clear break with these earlier traditions. All these other earlier Christian democratic thinkers with their various strategies were all acutely aware of the dangers of concentrations of power. They always insisted on an image of society which dispersed power, which recognized what they saw as organically grown communities, entities, the family, of course. One doesn't have to accept all that. But the point was that you had a very differentiated and highly pluralistic landscape. And concentrations of power and nation-state sovereignty were in and of themselves very suspect propositions for them. On one level, you might say, historically, it's easy to explain. Because if you think of those countries where basically newly unified nation states, Germany and Italy being the obvious examples, attacked Catholics. This is, as everybody knows, the process to which we owe the wonderful term culture war, Kulturkampf. That's what Bismarck does vis-a-vis Catholics in the 19th century. If that's your starting point, of course you're going to be suspicious of concentrations of power and nation-state sovereignty in particular. So this is one important break that we're seeing. And the other important break is simply that all these earlier Christian Democrats, as hopefully has become clear, had no investment in the nation as such, and no normative investment in the nation state as an entity as such. So if you can perhaps think of figures today who go around Europe and say, I am the last true Christian Democrat, and that means you have to be illiberal and you have to be national, there are reasons to doubt whether this is really a faithful rendering of the traditions which are being invoked and claimed. Because they certainly, these thinkers I've been looking at, certainly were not invested in any kind of nationalism. If you don't believe me, one last bit of evidence, something that happened very recently, and some of you may have followed it for all I know. Online, on a platform formerly known as Twitter, there was a kind of spat between our vice president and the former Minister of State for Prisons, Rory Stewart. And it concerned the correct interpretation of St. Augustine's notion of ordo amoris. And you'll be absolutely shocked to hear that our vice president, in essence, defended a vision that said, okay, ordo amoris, the order of love, means you start with the near and dear. And then it's sort of a matter of concentric circles. Then you sort of move out from there. After family, it's of course, the nation. And eventually you might sort of get to something that looks a little bit more like universalism. And Stewart was pushing back against that. And of course, they were, among other things, talking about immigration, asylum policies, and refugees. So people noticed this, and they were wondering, how was this going to be resolved? And eventually, a figure who, as far as I know, is not entirely irrelevant for Catholics, it's called Francis, decided to weigh in on this issue. And he wrote a letter to US bishops. And if I may, I'll just quote very briefly from what he wrote. Christian love, this is Francis, Christian love is not a concentric expansion of interests that little by little extend to other persons and groups. In other words, the human person is not a mere individual, relatively expansive with some philanthropic feelings. The human person is a subject with dignity who, through the constitutive relationship with all, especially with the poorest, can gradually mature in his identity and vocation. Forgive the gendered language. The true ordo amoris that must be promoted is that which we discover by meditating constantly on the parable of the Good Samaritan. That is, by meditating on the love that builds a fraternity open to all without exception. Now, we don't know whether the vice president took this on board or not. Early indications are that he may not have done so. Then again, if you're one of those people who in the 50s would have said, let's not elect Kennedy because he's going to take, cues from Rome, so that's very dangerous, very undemocratic. Maybe it's good news that, political personnel is not simply listening to what the Pope tells them to think. I leave that to you in terms of how you ultimately think about this normatively. The point is simply that this is, in a sense, I think, as clear as possible as far as a message is concerned, that the nation does not have sort of strong, independent, normative/moral weight, and that those who sell themselves as Christian Democrats and combine that with a strong form of nationalism don't really have a super plausible proposition to put forward. Thank you for your attention, and I hope we have a chance to discuss some of this stuff in more detail.